Good evening. It's time for us to go ahead and get our Bible class for the evening running as we are making our way through an overview, predominantly right now, of the Old Testament scriptures. As we have been going through, obviously, just to catch ourselves up with a quick review, where does it all begin? All right. Well, that's where we are right now, but the whole story begins at creation, where God looked and what? All right, saw that it was very good. After he finished up his creation, he saw that it was very good until what? All right, and then what chapter, book chapter do we have that? All right, Genesis chapter 3, which is the first of the 5 key passages that we find through the Old Testament. This one describes what event? Adam and Eve, but what's the word that we typically will use for that? All right, this is the fall narrative, the sin narrative. Remember, the word fall's not in the text. That's a word we use for it. But it describes the entrance of sin into the world, and what comes with sin? Death comes with sin, so that as you work your way through the first 11 chapters, what you have is a lot of sin and a lot of death. What 2 major narratives, you could say 3, although one of them is kind of part of the Genesis 3 narrative, but what major narratives do we find in the first 11 chapters? All right, so the Cain and Abel story, which is actually a part of the Genesis 3 story. If you recall, Genesis 3 and 4 are a package together. So you have the Genesis 3 and the Cain and Abel story. And then what's the next big story? All right, the flood story, where God again looked, and this time, what did he see? Was it very good? No, it was very bad. This time it was very bad. This time he looked, and behold, you have the same language, behold, man's thoughts were on evil continually, and it was now corrupt, is the idea. So, you have the flood narrative. What other narrative? All right, the Tower of Babel, where they were trying to make a what? All right, a great name for themselves, and yet, why was that a problem? Remember, how do you say name in Hebrew? Shem, right? God had already created his great name that he was going to have, the line of Shem. And the problem there, remember as well, they weren't going out and populating the world. They were rejecting, sticking a high fist before God and saying, no, we're not going to do what we're told. You want us to spread out? We're going to form together to get ourselves a seat at your table, and God messed all that up for them. That brings us then to our second key passage. What's that? All right, Genesis 12. And what do we have in Genesis 12? All right, very good. The promises to Abraham. What are the 3 main ones that we focused on? Nation, land, and seed, right? And so those are going to kind of lead our discussion throughout the rest. So finishing up Genesis, after Abraham, who's next? Isaac, who really doesn't have a whole lot to himself, but who gets a huge chunk? Jacob, and then finally Joseph, right? And remember, in Joseph's narrative, who's the one that actually sees the most growth and kind of becomes one of the main protagonists of the Joseph story? It's Judah, and we see Judah's narrative is really important to that as well. All right, this brings them down. Joseph's story brings them into what place? All right, so now they are in Egypt. They're going to be down there for a few hundred years until who comes onto the scene? All right, until Moses comes onto the scene, and now we're looking at approximately, at least my preference on dating it, approximately what time? What's that? 1500? Yeah, around 1500, 1450 is what I would typically put on this. Although I should kind of put this up here because that's where I have the line right up here. What happens around 1450 when they are brought out and they're led to what mountain? All right, Mount Sinai. First of all, how did they get out? What did God do? What did God bring upon the Egyptians? The plagues, right? All right, God brought the plagues upon them. What was the final one? All right, the death of the firstborn. And the only means by which the Israelites escaped it was, all right, the blood that was placed. We call it the Passover. The blood that was placed as a sign on the doorpost, the lintel. So you have the Passover, and then this great, what I would consider to be the third key passage of the Old Testament. They go to Sinai, and what do? All right, excellent. They make a covenant with God. How did they make that covenant? Okay, well, not necessarily at this moment. They're going to do something with that, later when they build the tabernacle. Okay, they gave the 10 Commandments. All right, to form the covenant, they sprinkle blood on the people. They sprinkle blood on the altar. And what does that do? What's the blood supposed to accomplish? All right, it's like signing, it's like the ink that signs the contract between the people and God. Give me a book and chapter here. All right, very good. Exodus chapter 24, they enter into a covenant, and then God leads them up to take the land, but what do? Excellent, Joshua. It's exactly right. They say, no, we'd rather die in the wilderness. And God says, okay. That's right, Joshua. If you want to die in the wilderness, I'll let you die in the wilderness, and your children will enter into the land. So they wandered for how long? 40 years. And then at the end of that, who leads them into the land? All right, Joshua. We'll put that there. And so we have Joshua leads them in, and he beats the armies, but have they conquered the land? No, they haven't. At the end of Joshua, they divvy up the land, and then you get into Judges, and it says, all right, now it's time to conquer. Now it's time to get in, drive the peoples out of their homes, their places, their cities, and live in houses you haven't built, and harvest crops that you did not plant. And you turn the page into Judges, how well did they do? All right, if you had one word to describe the book of Judges, what word might you use? Failure. The book of Judges is about abject failure. And remember, it starts off not too bad as you go through what we call the Judges cycle. If you remember, everything's fine until they sin. And then when they sin, God brings an oppressor. They cry out to God. So he brings a deliverer for them. They have peace for so many years until they sin again. You kind of just go through this over and over. But what's the thing? As you go through Judges, the stories get what? The stories get worse. It's like a downward spiral, really, as you go through the Judges. In fact, Mark talked about that this morning, and he talked about these people at the end of Judges, the Gideons, the Jephthahs, the Samsons, these people at the end, that it just gets worse as you go down. It ends with Samson, who is just about one of the worst characters that you find within the Bible, because he's all about whom? Him. He's all about himself and what is right in his eyes. Right? Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. And that leads then in those two narratives at the end of Judges. What's that, Joshua? Okay, well, we're not there yet. Hold your horses right there, because you are absolutely right. He knows exactly where we're going, and we're going to be there in just a second. But the end of Judges, you have these narratives that both begin there was a man in the hill country of Ephraim, right? And so now you begin to see, okay, well, the story that begins, there was a man in the hill country of Ephraim. It's going to be a pretty bad story. Things are not going to go well because these are horrific stories at the end of Judges. And it has this inclusio that you find at the beginning and the end of chapter 17, and then at the end of 21, the very last verse. Again, I think Mark brought this up this morning and quoted this verse. In those days, there was what? No king in Israel, and... All right, very good. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges is setting up the idea of the king. And remember, in the Hebrew Bible, when you flip from Judges, what book do you go into? You go straight into Samuel. Remember, Ruth was in a different section in the Hebrew Bible. It's there for us, and there's a good reason, because chronologically speaking, it's set in the time frame of the Judges. But for them, you went straight from a narrative that started, there was a man in the hill country of Ephraim, to another narrative at the end of Judges. There was a man from the hill country of Ephraim. And then Joshua, 1 Samuel, begins with the story about what? A man from... All right, a man from the hill country of Ephraim. And right now you're thinking, oh man, not another one of these. I'm tired of these horrible stories about people from the hill country of Ephraim. But is this a bad one? No. Who comes out of this one? Yeah, out of this one, you have the story of Samuel. And so Samuel comes in. These are other cities, by the way, I meant to mention, at the end of Judges, in those last two stories in Judges. Gibeah plays a part. Remember, Gibeah was the place that the man and his concubine turned into because they didn't go to where? They didn't go to Jebus of the Jebusites. They could have gone to Jebus, which is going to eventually be what city? Jerusalem. And so you have Jebus there. You have Gibeah that features prominently. And Bethlehem features in both stories. And then you also have the men of Jabesh Gilead, or I should say the women of Jabesh Gilead. They were the ones that they went and grabbed women from there in order to repopulate what tribe of Israel that got into a civil war and almost decimated at the end of Judges? The tribe of Benjamin. Carry that little bit of information. There are women taken from Jabesh Gilead who were used to repopulate the tribe of Benjamin. All right, so I'm stressing it, so there's got to be something coming up, right? Yeah, we'll see Jabesh Gilead again real soon. I think we'll see it real soon. Okay, we now move forward in Samuel, and remember at the beginning what takes place? Not the very beginning. We passed the story with Hannah, the dedication of Samuel. Samuel is used as a prophet in order to bring a declaration against Eli and his sons. And how does that happen? Yeah, that's right. Where did they die? How did they die? Yeah? That's right. They died in the war. They died in battle because they lost the battle initially. And they said, oh man, I know why we lost. We didn't bring God with us. Someone go get God and bring him. And so they grabbed the Ark of the Covenant and they brought him in. And they're like, all right, we've got God. He's attached with the leash to this box right here. So we know he's here and we're going to win. And they got slaughtered even worse. Eli's sons were killed. The Ark of the Covenant was taken. And when news reached Eli, what happened? His neck broke. That's exactly right. He fell over backwards because he was a heavy man, right? And remember that word heavy carries more than just the idea of poundage. Yeah, that's right. He fell and he broke his neck. But remember, the idea of heavy, also that word is an important word to speak of importance that people have. Anyway, he dies, and his daughter-in-law bears a child, and what does she name the child? Ichabod, which means, she said, I did that because the glory has departed from Israel. It's gone. This is it. We're done. We're finished. This is the end. That's the way it seemed. And then Samuel comes on to the scene. The Ark of the Covenant, by the way, comes back. Right? We're familiar with all the damage that it does among the Philistines. The Ark of the Covenant comes back. Samuel then kind of takes over and acts in what capacities for Israel? Prophet, priest, and pseudo-king, right? I mean, he acts as their judge, their deliverer, their leader. So he, acts in those capacities and saves them. They have the battle. They win the battle. And then you get to chapter 8, and the people came to him years later, and they said, your sons are corrupt, and you're, basically right on death's door. We want a what? All right, we want a king, all right, like all the other nations. Was it wrong for them to ask for a king like all the other nations? No. How do we know it's not wrong for them to ask for a king like all the other nations? All right, because God said that. What were you going to say, Olivia? All right, because that was God's plan all along. You go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, and it specifically says, when you ask for a king, like all the other nations around you, this is the way you're supposed to do it. So there wasn't anything inherently wrong with asking for a king like the other nations. The problem is that they did it while what? Okay, they already had one. All right, they did it while rejecting God. That's the issue at hand. Their rejection of Samuel becomes a rejection of God himself. And that's what really kind of annoys. And then we haven't gotten there yet, but in chapter 12, they wanted a king that could stand up to whom? Anybody remember? All right, Nahash, the king of the Ammonites. That's what they wanted. A king who could stand up to the Ammonites. Was that their real enemy, by the way? No. Going all the way back to Judges, when Samson was appointed, he was supposed to begin their defeat over whom? Over the Philistines. The Philistines are the enemy that God has designated. And yet the people are saying, we want someone who can stand up to the Ammonites. And remember when we had up here the name, Saul's name, and then we had what other word? The word for what? He asked. And you saw that those two were very similar to each other. In other words, what did God give the people? All right, what they asked for. The name of Saul basically is derived from the question, or from the statement, he asked. And Saul is basically what they asked for. You can see that just in the Hebrew name itself. All right, so we go back to chapter 10, and now we look at the anointing of Saul. And last week, I said that there's basically 3 parts to a king becoming a king. And, I use certain words. I think I've got other words that we can use to get proper alliteration, because, alliteration is really important. I'm trying to remember exactly what those words were. I've got them. That could be. First of all, yes, Yeah, I wish that last week I would have said something like dedication, demonstration, declaration, or consecration, confirmation, coronation. Either one of those would have worked. But let's go with the D ones. All right, so a dedication. And how does the dedication work? What does that mean? The king is what? All right, this is the anointing that takes place, which seems to be a private affair, right? This isn't something where everybody's gathered together for the anointing of the king. It's usually done in private in some kind of a way. And then that's followed by a what? All right, a demonstration of some sort by which, after they've been dedicated, they've been anointed, something happens by which everybody sees this is the work of God. God is working through this person very clearly. This person should be our king, and that is then followed up with a what? All right, a public declaration or coronation. This is where they will crown the anointed as the king. This is the way that it's supposed to work, and the way that we're going to see that it kind of works with somebody. But it doesn't work this way with whom? It doesn't work this way with Saul. Because Saul was dedicated at the beginning of chapter 10, right? He was anointed by Samuel in chapter 10, verse 1. And then Samuel said, hey, just to make sure that you know that God is with you on this, here's a very detailed list of all kinds of things that are going to take place. And at the end of this time, that all of these things are going to happen, you're going to be beside a what? You're going to be beside a garrison of the Philistines. Do what the moment requires. Do what your hand finds to do. Do, whatever translation that you have there. Around, let's see, verse 6, chapter 10, verse 6. Verse 7, I'm sorry. When these signs have happened to you, do whatever your circumstances require. That's the CSB. I think ESV, do what your hand finds to do. In other words, this is your moment. Take advantage of it. What was his hand supposed to find to do here? He's supposed to take out the garrison of the Philistines. That's what his hand is supposed to do. And he says, after you've done what's required, wait for how long? All right, go to Gilgal, wait for 7 days, and then I will come to you. Does he do what his hand is supposed to do? He does not. Where does he go? After he goes to the high place, he then... What's that? Well, donkeys have already been found by this point. Where does he go? He basically just goes home, doesn't he? And his uncle's like, hey, I heard you went and talked to the seer. You talked to Samuel. What did he tell you? And does he say, oh, he told me I'm going to be king? No, he's like, oh, he just told me they found the donkeys. And that's it. And that's the whole story. Saul does not have what moment? There's no demonstration moment with Saul. Instead of doing what he's supposed to do, he shirks back instead. So, they have a declaration. God is still going to declare him as king, but instead of everybody rallying behind the obvious choice, who has demonstrated in battle that God is with him, instead of that, what do they have to do? All right, they have to cast lots in order to determine who's going to be the king. And the lot falls down, by tribe, family, or clan family, falls on Saul. Where is he? Hiding where? All right, he's hiding in the baggage. And again, I think it's important that as we're going through this story, we are making a comparison. Here is Saul, and over here is whom? Here is David. And we're supposed to make these comparisons in order to determine how are we to understand this story. Remember in Saul's declaration, whole beginning thing, he was going after animals. What was his mindset towards these animals? Y'all remember? Yeah, he goes, by this time my father's probably going to be more worried about me than the donkeys. Let's just let them go and let's go home. And it was the person with him's like, well, let's at least go and talk to the prophet. I mean, we don't want to give up yet, so quickly. What about David? What's his attitude towards those that were gone in his story, early story? Yeah, he tells Saul how he killed the bear, he killed the lion who had taken one of the sheep. You have a difference in attitude there. And then we have the word baggage shows up here. When's the next time that the word baggage shows up in Samuel? Y'all remember we talked about this? We haven't gotten there yet, and we're going to spend a decent amount of time there when we get there, but all right, the story of David and Goliath. You go to chapter 17, right? When Saul was supposed to be receiving his kingship, he refused it and went to the baggage to hide from it, right? What does David do? Yeah, David goes to the baggage, and he leaves the baggage to go to the front line where he's going to have his public demonstration type of a moment, right? You see a stark difference in the way that the word baggage is used and how it comes up in these two stories. One goes to the baggage to hide, the other one leaves the baggage to go to his ultimate destiny. And so you see just this individual who just, someone last week, I don't remember who it was, kind of used the word coward. And that's, I think, kind of the picture that we're supposed to see. That even though this man, what was his stature like? All right, head and shoulders above everyone else. If you looked at Saul, you'd be like, that's my king right there. He looked the part. Everything about him, you're like, yes, this guy is regal, but inwardly, he didn't have it. So this brings us then to chapter 11. And in chapter 11, it begins with whom? All right. Now we have that guy from, in chapter 12 that we talked about, Nahash the what? The Ammonite. He goes and he besieges what city? Jabesh Gilead. Have we heard Jabesh Gilead before? I don't know. It seems like we've talked about Jabesh Gilead. Anybody recognize Jabesh Gilead? Yeah, it's right here, right? Yeah, now, let's remember, Jabesh Gilead, what part did it play in the Judges' narrative? Well, back in the Judges' time frame. Jabesh Gilead, what part does it play in the Judges? All right, remember they made a pact. All these people made a pact that they weren't going to give their women to Benjamin, and they were going to make them pay. And then they turned a tide, and then they felt really sorry for Benjamin. They're like, oh man, I wish we hadn't vowed that we wouldn't give our women to them. Who's going to repopulate the tribe of Benjamin now? And someone's like, Jabesh Gilead isn't here. And then everyone's all up in arms like, yeah, why didn't they come here? They should have come here and they should have made this vow. And so it's a highly ironic scenario where they say, we need to punish Jabesh Gilead for not doing what we did that we wished we hadn't done. It's kind of convoluted. So they want to go and punish them and steal women from Jabesh Gilead to bring to what tribe again? The tribe of Benjamin. What place does the tribe of Benjamin play in 1 Samuel? Did I hear someone? Yeah, Ryan?
It's from. It's where David is from.
Well, David was Judah.
Judah, that's right.
Keep going. From who was from Benjamin? Did someone say it and I missed it? Yeah. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, which means, is there perhaps some sense in which there's a family connection with Saul and the rest of Benjamin with the city of Jabesh Gilead? Knowing that there were women who were taken from here in order to help repopulate the tribe of Benjamin, I think there's a very real sense in which there could be a familial connection to the people of this place. Which is why when Ammon and Nahash, they come up and they lay siege to Jabesh Gilead here in chapter 11. And it's one of those stories where I'm like, we don't live in that time. We don't live in their culture. It's hard to understand exactly what's taking place and what's happening here. But they surround it, and the men of Jabesh, they say to Nahash, look, make a treaty with us, we'll serve you. But Nahash, the Ammonite, said, I'll do it on this condition that I get to gouge out all of your right eyes to bring disgrace on all of Israel. And that's the condition. And and I love this next part where they're like, well, that sounds reasonable, but give us 7 days and let's see. We're going to send people out and let's see if anybody comes to save us. And I would think that Nahash would be like, yeah, that's funny. Forget that. But he does. He's like, okay, that's reasonable. All this stuff that seems reasonable that to me, but it's a different culture, a different place, a different way of thinking, a different way of doing things, right? We've talked about entering into somebody else's contextual space. And that's what's going on right here. So the messengers go out and they report what's happening. Now in verse 5, chapter 11, verse 5, this is a verse that I have used before in order to make a point of how good Saul was to begin with. And I think I messed it up. In chapter 11 and verse 5, the word gets out, right? And verse 4, the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul. By the way, where is Saul from again? This city that plays a huge part in the narratives in Judges, right? So this is where Saul is from. So when they came here, it came to all the people wept aloud. What was Saul doing? How does Saul hear about this? All right, he comes in from working the field. He's out there with the oxen. And and I've talked about this before in various times when I've taught through this. It's like, man, look at this humble character. He's just one of the good old boys. He's a blue-collar worker. He's out there with all the other folks getting in the dirt, getting in the mud, doing the work. He's out there with the oxen. What a great king. What's the problem with that? Yeah, Kelly?
He's got a city in his kingdom under attack, and he doesn't know about it.
Okay, because he's not what? He's not leading. He's not acting like a king. This is a man, this is just one more of the examples of an individual who is being thrust into kingship, but he's what? Well, he might be capable. I mean, he's going to demonstrate that here, but he's not acting like it. He's not willing to man up and do what God is telling him to do. He's refusing to act like a king. And I think it's important that we see this in that light, that Israel has a king, God gave them a king, but this king is not acting like a king. He's out there in the fields, plowing fields, when God has called him to be something different, to be something different from the rest of them. And as Kelly points out, this is why he has no idea what's taking place. Everyone else hears about this before even he does. So, at this point, remember we talked about intertextuality, stories that have a tendency, bits and pieces of stories that repeat themselves in certain narratives as it comes up. And so you now have another story that is very much like the last story that Gibeah played a part of, in which he takes his yoke of oxen and does what to them? All right, cuts them up and sends them throughout Israel. Now, I don't want to go into the details, but have we seen something like this before? Yeah. I mean, it wasn't an ox. It was something else. Again, I don't want to go into the details. These certain things that I'm not going into detail about. But again, he uses this process to muster the people and get them to join with him. And so all of the people do, and this time they go to Jabesh, not to destroy Jabesh Gilead, but this time in order to save Jabesh Gilead. Do they do so? Yes. This is Saul's finest hour. This is the apex. I mean, this is the best moment in Saul's career. And there's not a whole lot besides saying that maybe some of the tactics look like those that you found at the end of Judges, which was a very negative thing there and maybe carrying over to some degree. But in this story right here, this is Saul finally looking like a king and being the king and doing what it is that he's supposed to do. And he does that against whom? Well, not against God. He's doing it for God, but against what nation? Ammon, and against Nahash. Very specifically, the one enemy that Israel said, we want a king that can stand toe-to-toe with these people and defeat them. And so what did God provide for them? The king who stood toe-to-toe with Ammon and defeated them. What we're going to find is that Saul is not the king who can stand toe-to-toe and defeat whom? The Philistines. But that's further down the story. But he is the one who stands up and defeats the one peoples, according to chapter 12, that Israel was really concerned about. This is finally Saul's what? His demonstration. This gets moved down here. It's all out of order. But after he does this, are the people behind him? Absolutely. Remember, they said, hey, bring those worthless fellows from before. We didn't talk about that. But worthless fellows from before who said, can we really trust Saul to lead us? And let's do them in. And Saul, he's like, no. Hey, today's the day of celebration. Nobody's dying today. Yeah, and so you see this, because it's out of order, it takes this demonstration for the people to get behind Saul 100%. This is the way it was supposed to be in the beginning, except against what group of people? It was supposed to be against the Philistines. If he would have taken out that garrison of Philistines and created, oh, well, you know what? We'll talk about that in a second. I'm just going to drop that thought for just a moment. It was supposed to be against the Philistines, but instead it's here. All right, now, chapter 12. I'm barreling through a lot of this. Are there comments or questions on the stuff that we've talked about so far? I know a lot of this is kind of review, but I wanted to make sure it was fresh in our minds. All right. So chapter 12 we've kind of talked about already. When we discussed this before, Samuel is kind of making, it's almost a retirement announcement or farewell address, or he's basically saying, I'm no longer going to be the leader that I have been. You've got your king now. You've got what you asked for. And isn't that what he specifically says? You got the king you asked for. But does it all look hunky-dory and pretty and beautiful in Samuel's address here? Not really. There's still a lot of negativity that comes through, and you see a lot of the same type of language that was at the end of Deuteronomy, that's at the end of Joshua. This language that says you're standing on a precipice right now. You've got two choices before you. Either serve the Lord, do what you're supposed to do and be blessed, or don't serve the Lord and be cursed. The choice is yours. And just as we've seen time and time again, the people declare that they will what? Yeah. They declare that they will serve the Lord, but there's not that same type of optimism that you find from the one who's making the address. Again, this is very, very much akin to what you find at the end of Deuteronomy with Moses and the end of Joshua and their final declarations that they make. All right, so this moves us then, with the time that we have left, we'll start to get into this, chapters 13 and 14, in which, contrary to what I said just a few minutes ago, Saul's going to be what? All right, he's going to stand up and be the king, sort of. But who are they going to be fighting? The Philistines, right? Is he going to lose? No. So you may wonder, well, how is it that I could say that he failed against the Philistines? You're not supposed to give answers yet. If you heard Joe's, you probably didn't hear. If you heard it, strike it from the record. You're not supposed to hear the correct answers just yet. In case you didn't hear what you weren't supposed to hear, she said he wasn't the one who really defeated them. So forget that you heard that, all right? Just strike it now, and we'll eventually get there, all right? Can't believe you've given away the answers, Josie. All right. Yeah, you get into chapter 13, and by the way, chapter 13 begins with what event? How does chapter 13 begin? I got the right chapter, right? No, verse 3, what happens? What's that? Okay, but what gets destroyed? All right, there's a garrison of the Philistines at Geba that gets taken out. Does that sound familiar, by the way, to anybody else? Who was supposed to have done that? You go back to chapter 10, this is the garrison of the Philistines that Saul was supposed to do what his hand finds to do, and he doesn't do it. And when his hand was supposed to do it, that was going to start a time or Oh, good grief. What's the word when the time goes down? What's that? A countdown. Sure, that'll work. A timer, countdown, something. Anyway, it's going to start the clock, right? And how many days then did Samuel say, wait, and then I will come? 7 days, right? So, Saul doesn't do it. Jonathan takes out this garrison, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do. Who lines up? Who hears about it and then comes and surrounds Israel at Gilgal? The Philistines. And that's when you come in, verse 8, and Saul waited how many days? Waited 7 days. Where does it say that Saul's supposed to wait 7 days for Samuel to arrive? Chapter 10, right? He says, when this garrison gets destroyed, the clock starts. You've got 7 days that you wait for me, and then I will arrive, and I will tell you then what to do. And so Saul recognizes this. He wasn't the one who took out the garrison. It was his son. But it happens all the same. And he waits 7 days, and he gets there, and what's happening now after 7 days? All right, Samuel's not there. What's taking place? People are getting scared, and they're starting to desert. They're leaving. People are frightened. They may have been gung-ho a few days ago, but it's been 7 days. They've been idle. They've not been doing anything. The army around them is huge. They're scared to death. And he says, if I keep waiting, I'm not even going to have an army to attack with. So what's he do? All right, he offers a sacrifice. And as soon as he offers that sacrifice, what happens? All right, Samuel shows. It's almost like Samuel was sitting there camped out in the bushes watching and just waiting. He's like, oh, he's got about 3 more hours. We're down to, nope, there he is. Okay, he did it. All right. And then, and Samuel has this knack of showing up at just the right time type of a thing, right? He shows up and he's like, what have you done? Verse 11, Samuel said, what have you done? And you see Saul, when I saw the people were scattering and you didn't come in the time that you said you were going to, the Philistines were mustered together. I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord, so I what? I forced myself. I didn't want to do it. You made me do this. This is your fault, Samuel, because you didn't show up on time. Any of this, sound familiar? This is your fault. Almost any time that sin takes place, this is your fault. It starts back with the woman that what? You gave me, right? This isn't my fault. And I haven't been doing it, but you're going to find an awful lot of language that uses the word saw or took, things such as that goes all the way back to Genesis 3. That when she saw, she took, right? They ate, their eyes were opened, and then a lot of blaming that oftentimes is going to take place. And then here is the repercussions for that. Verse 13, Samuel said, you have done foolishly. You did not keep the commandment of the Lord your God when he commanded you. The Lord would have established your king over Israel forever. Chapter 13, verse 14, now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man, what? A man what? I know Connie said it. Someone else say it. All right. I need a lot of people mumbling this one, right? A man after his own heart. Y'all have heard this one before, right? This is where this really begins, right here, where he says, Samuel says to him, you could have had your family established forever. But you blew it. And now that reigning dynasty, enduring dynasty, is going to be given over to a man whose heart is like God's, a man after his heart. And the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded. So Samuel rose, left Gilgal, and the rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. They went from Gilgal to Gibeah Benjamin. And so you have then this discussion. We don't have the time tonight to do justice to this battle, but I do want to at least make this point, and this is what Josie was saying just a second ago. Who is the hero of the battle of the Philistines? Is this a moment in which Saul comes out and demonstrates who he is? Whose moment is this? For those of you who know this story. Jonathan, do you have any ideas? Jonathan, do you have any ideas? Jonathan, nailed it. Yes, nice. Fist bump right there. Yeah, this is Jonathan's victory. This is not Saul's victory. Jonathan is the one who took out the garrison. Jonathan is the one that has the details of the story. The thing that Saul is known for in this battle narrative is making a stupid rule that no one's allowed to eat or drink until the battle's completely over or they will die. That's not a very smart rule to make when you're in the middle of battle. And somebody does eat something. Who eats a little something? Jonathan does. He sees some honey and he's like, I need a little pick-me-up right now, and that honey's just the thing. And it helps them, and they work through the night, and they win this battle. And then, so they pursue the Philistines and all of that. Let me make sure that I'm in the correct spot here. Let's see, verse 36, Saul said, "Let us go down after the Philistines by night, plunder them until the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them." And they said, "Do whatever seems good to you." But the priest said, "Let us draw near to God here." And Saul inquired of the Lord. This is, by the way, this is chapter 14, verse 37. "Shall I go after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel?" But he did not answer him. And Saul said, "Come here, all the leaders, and know this. There has been a sin today, as the Lord lives who saves Israel, even if it's Jonathan, my son, he will surely die." Who was it? It was Jonathan. And so when that gets found out, let's see here. Verse 41, "Therefore Saul said, O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant? If this guilt is in me or in Jonathan, my son, the God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people, give Thummim." And this is a casting lots type of an idea. "And Jonathan and Saul were taken. The people escaped. Cast lots between me and my son Jonathan. Jonathan was taken. And Saul said to Jonathan, 'Tell me what you have done.' And he said, 'I took honey. Here I am. I will die.'" He had already pointed out, by the way, that this was a stupid thing for his father to have said. He had already mentioned that. He had already said it. This is really dumb. But he says, "All right, I've done it. I will die." Verse 44, Saul said, "God do so to me and more. You will surely die, Jonathan." Verse 45. How did the people react? In verse 45, how did the people react? They will not let the king do what the king has said that he's going to do. Is this a clear demonstration of a victorious king who has the people behind him? He can't even follow through with an edict that he created. The people ransom him back, is the word. The people stand between them, and the people say, no, 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 no. I don't care if you're king. He's the hero of this battle. You will not do this to him. Far be it from us, right, is the idea. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair of his head fall to the ground. He has worked with God this day. And there the battle stops. Saul does not defeat the Philistines. Jonathan's the hero of the battle, and they didn't even completely finish it. But you can see the relationship that the king has with his people, where they're like, no, you can't dictate what we will or we will not do. And this will bring us then into chapter 15 next week, where we will talk about probably the most well-known story, I'm guessing, in Saul's narrative, and that is the dealings with the Amalekites. And we will jump on that next week. All right, any closing comments or questions before I turn this back over to Richard? All right, I will turn it over to Richard then. Thanks a lot, guys. Good class.